Welcome to Author Voices on Air, and I'm your host, Rick Bell. Our next book, entitled Minley Manor, which was a large family house that became part of a military training establishment and then an officers' mess for the Corps of Royal Engineers. Yet the story of Minley Manor is also the story of the Curry family, whose 3 generations living at Minley created a magnificent manor house in the innovative architectural style. Joining me now to tell us more of Minley Manor and the Curry family is the author Major Ian C Mattison. Welcome to the show, Ian, and thank you for joining me. Now, the title of the book, as I mentioned during the introduction, not just about its use as a military establishment, but also as the family home of the Curry family. But one question that came immediately to mind for me, because of the connection with the military and its use as a training establishment and an officer's mess, and I believe your correct title is, as I mentioned during the introduction, Major Ian C Mattison. So is there a connection between your military connection and the manor itself?
Yes, well, in 1976, shortly after the Royal Engineers took over from the Army Staff College, who'd had it since 1939, I was at Sandhurst in 1976, and shortly after I finished my Sandhurst course, I was commissioned in August that year, I then went on what was known as the Young Officers course, which was in Chatham in Kent. But also, we had to visit various places, and one of the places that we visited was the new officers' mess at Gibraltar Barracks, known as Minley Manor. And that was the first time that I had seen it. So I've known the place since 1976, when I was commissioned. So basically, I've known it throughout my career. I then left, got my posting in Germany, when it came back into England a couple of years later. And in late 1980, promoted to captain, I was then sent to what was called the Central Volunteer Headquarters of the Royal Engineers. And I inquired, where's that? Never heard of that. And they said, oh, it's Minley Manor. So I went back to Minley Manor in 1980, and my office was actually in the manor house itself. I stayed there for 3 years to 1983, when I then left the army, pursued my own sort of civilian career. But in 1997, I was asked to go back into the army as a reservist, and having reported to the mobilisation centre at Sandhurst, I then had to pick up more equipment of my Royal Engineers, and I had to go to a place called Minley Manor.
So it's very much a part of your life and your career. Now,
it certainly is, yes.
Can I ask, the next question has to be, how did that become the inspiration for you writing this book? I mean, it's not, as we've mentioned, it's not just about the manor itself, but it's very much about the Curry family. So tell us a little of the story behind what inspired the book and how it all began for you as an author.
Yeah, well, when I first went to Minley, it was a magnificent house, and it looked really fine. And then when I was there for 2 years, I met 3 very significant people, a chap called David Davenport, a retired major himself from the Royal Engineers, and also a chap called Owen Holbrook, and then another retired officer called Peter Aston. And every year we used to have the Minley Fete, and these 2 gentlemen, Peter and Owen, used to act as guides and run the history of the manor house. It was quite sparse, it was quite nice, a bit succinct. But I became interested because, having lived there and my office was there, I wandered around and I got to wondering who had this before. And I never really sort of paid too much attention to that subsequently. But when I came back in 97, 98, I then went back into the mess as an officer's mess, various functions. And that's when it started to really intrigue me. And Peter Aston and Owen Holbrook by this time had finished. And I sort of then got to know the place a little bit more. Then in 2014, I was asked to help with the sale of Minley Manor. The MOD were selling Minley Manor. I knew about it, and I was asked by a couple of people to show them round the manor house with the representative of the MOD, who was quite impressed with my knowledge of the manor house. In late 2014, October, it was sold, and I became the chief operations officer for the new owner. And then, strangely enough, various bits and pieces, history, documents, little pamphlets, etc., all came into my possession.
I would describe the book as a history of the manor, but also a biography of the family. But when you were writing it, you must have had a particular person in mind, a particular reader in mind. So my next question is, who did you write the book for and why?
Well, basically for the Royal Engineers. I was in the Royal Engineers, as I've said to you, for quite a long time. And it was the Royal Engineers who really looked after the place from 1976 onwards. It was the senior division of the Staff College between 1939 and 1976, or 68 they actually left. And there's not really much history of that. And beyond that is all to do with the Curry family. But a lot of people in the Royal Engineers who I've spoken to or had met in my time, had served or been around Gibraltar Barracks or the officers' mess at Minley for many times themselves. There's many people who got married there. People have children christened in the local church, and of course in the cemetery, sadly, is a friend of mine who I knew in the Royal Engineers, and it was pointed out to me a couple of years ago. Go and have a look at the little grave size inside the church, and there is a little grave of a friend I used to know quite well in the Royal Engineers called Graham Chunky Chilton, as we used to know him. So it was mainly for them that I wanted to have the history of Minley and Minley Manor, because they all served at Minley Manor at one stage. So there'll be a lot of Royal Engineers, even soldiers, because surrounding the manor house is a training area. So a lot of the soldiers will know of Minley Manor and the training area around Minley. And as they pass through the training area, they can look up and there's this manor house on the top of the hill. So it's mainly for them. That was my market, if you like. That was my early target. But as it developed, there's far bigger interest of the local people in the Fleet, Yateley, Blackwater area. So it's expanded to more people interested, not just in the engineers, but outside.
Without giving too much away, tell us a little bit of any particular characters that you feel really come out in this book.
Well, I spent a large part of the book in chapter 4 is all about Bertram Woodhouse Curry. But Raikes Curry was the man who built the manor house on the old site that was there. He built this new manor house, and he asked the architect Henry Clutton to design it, and it's a sort of like French Gothic style. That's the first time a house had been built like that in this country. So that was a sort of really turning point. And Raikes Curry was obviously quite a wealthy man. He was MP for Northamptonshire, and he really put his heart and soul into the banking industry. And he was a promoter of the Banking Act in 1844, which then restricted only the Bank of England could produce money, to print money. But it was his son Bertram who really lit up for me, and I found out his memoirs, etc. And he was such a character that really he's been underrepresented in our world. And him and the Curry family, they really have been sort of underappreciated, because he was so well thought of in the banking industry. As you see, there's an epitaph to him written in the Times by William Gladstone, who was a personal friend of his, and there's a plaque in Minley planted by William Gladstone when he visited in 1893. When he visited Bertram, he planted a tree, and the plaque is still there. The tree isn't, but the plaque is still there. And then he became a real advisor to Chancellors of the Exchequer. He was the man who helped to rescue Barings Bank in 1890. Unfortunately, as you say, Barings Bank, we know what happened to them only a few years ago. But that's the sort of character that Bertram was. And then his son, Lawrence Currie, carried on the tradition in-house, and he became an ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, etc. So there was the Currie family are full of people who are quite significant in our world, sort of 19th century, late 19th century Victorian finance world. That sort of, why were they missed off in history? That was I wanted to get it out into the book, that this sort of chap was more significant than we've ever given him credit for.
And you've certainly done them justice in your book. Now, going back to the writing of the book itself, as a first-time author, and I know you've explained you had a lot of knowledge and a lot of history yourself with Minley Manor, but you must have faced some challenges when you sat down and put the proverbial pen to paper and decided to write this book. Tell us about some of those challenges.
Well, first of all, I'd never had a written book before, so it was a case of but I think I read somewhere, or I've heard somebody else say, never mind what it's all about, just write down what you think. Write down from your just write it down in any order that you think, any bits of anecdotes, any bits of history, write it down first before you ever think about how to structure it. So that was my main aim, is just to sit down and write various bits and pieces. So I would write about perhaps a bit of Bertram Currie, then Lawrence, and then the Royal Engineers, and then certain episodes in the play, and then find a bit of history about the other places the other buildings that are on the site. For instance, the Warren, which is a building that's just south of the church on the site, that was supposedly the home of Colonel Thomas Blood. And you have a look at who's Thomas Blood, and the next minute you're finding that he's the man who nearly stole the crown jewels from the Tower of London in 1670. He was caught, sent to Charles II. You expect him to really be either executed or locked up in the Tower, and he gets let off. And you think, well, that's significant. What has he got? And even today, nobody really knows the reason why he was let off. But you could sit there and speculate. But we found out a little bit more about him. So the challenge was just put it all down, and then try and structure it in a way that hopefully it would appeal to people who about the building, the architecture, and the gardens, and the trees, and the family, and then the military, and then some anecdotes of things like Colonel Thomas Blood, and some other things that went on in the manor house and in the area that gave it its character, that it really should get to be known again today.
Now, obviously, the achievement of writing a book and finishing the book and getting it published is a big thing. But apart from that, what did you find the most rewarding part of the whole experience?
I suppose, like most people, having the book, the final printed copy sent to me and in my hands, and look at it, not knowing what it was going to be like. I hadn't envisaged the book in the size and the structure that Author House have done with it, and that pleased me greatly. I've got lots of books. I was very privileged to go to a book launch of a book about the gardens of Hampshire, and some people who wrote the book came to see me whilst I was at Minley, and they asked to look around the gardens, and the gardens features in their book. And I was very privileged to go to the launch of the book, so I had an idea of what the book launch would be like and what size the book would be, etc. But my own book doesn't look anything like that. Their book is a smaller book, etc. So when I got the book in my hand and saw what they'd done with the pictures and the size of the book and the way that they've set out the writing size, etc., I was very pleased.
And quite rightly so. Has it inspired you as a writer to continue? Do you have any other books that are either already finished in the planning stages, or something that you have in your mind for another book?
Well, I never really planned anything beyond Minley Manor, because again, I thought, well, I'm not a writer by trade, but since the publication of the book and the help from Author House, and there's a personal consultant there who's been very, very good to me and really explained things as we've gone through. And at the end of it all, they were so pleased. And they've said to me, okay, if you want to continue, is there another subject you'd like to write the book about? So I've put together some ideas. I don't know if it'll be of interest, but it's going to be about my work during the time that I went to Bosnia, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, and Iraq. After reading this book, I think people will be excited about the launch of your new book, and we'll really look forward to that. Now, in closing, is there anything that we haven't covered that you feel is important that you would like our listeners to know? Well, I'd like to know that Minley Manor, I should say, belonged to the military from 1939 onwards. The local people in Yateley and Fleet, etc., many of them and their families might have worked at Minley Manor in the past on the estate. It was a huge estate, 2,500 acres. And it ran the farm. Lawrence ran the big farm on it. So many of them will find out, hopefully, if they look at the book, that they might intrigue them to look at their own family and see who worked there. I have some bits of history that point to a few people who were born there, were christened in the church, or people who were chauffeurs to some of the military who were there. So that's what I'd like to say, is that Minley Manor itself is going to now come back onto the consciousness of the people in the local area here in North Hampshire and Surrey. Minley Manor is published by Author House and is available direct from the publisher at authorhouse.com/bookstore and all good bookstockists. Once again, I'd like to thank my guest today, the author, Major Ian C. Mattison. Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much indeed. And we wish you every success, not only with this book, but with anything you write in the future. Yeah. It's also available through myself in my own website. It's quite simply www.ianmattison.uk. Well, there you go. You've just done it for us. Okay, thank you, Ian. Thank you very much. This is Rick Bell for TogiNet Radio 2.0.